Good morning, everybody. Lovely to welcome you all here, and a special word of welcome to Rod. This is the last in his series on battleships. It's been an absolutely fascinating series. Thank you very much, Rod, and we look forward to what you're going to give us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you again, Letitia, your kind words. This is indeed the last of the 4 battleship series, and we're going to talk about the Pacific and a little bit about what happened afterwards, particularly as it applies to battleships. The war in the Pacific started on the 7th of December 1941, Roosevelt's Day of Infamy. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched an attack on Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii. At the time, the US Navy had a lot of old and slow battleships. These were World War I Dreadnoughts. The USS Utah, on the left there, was commissioned in 1911. And she was essentially very similar to HMS Dreadnought. She carried 10, 12-inch guns, could manage 21 knots, and she displaced 22,000 tons, a comparatively small battleship. She was sunk at Pearl Harbor. There were 2 Nevada-class dreadnoughts. They were commissioned in 1916. They had 10 14-inch guns, slightly bigger, and at 27,500 tons, they were also slightly bigger ships. The Oklahoma was one of them, and she was sunk at Pearl Harbor as well. She was salvaged and essentially stripped of what they could get off her. The Nevada, the other one, was severely damaged. She was beached at Pearl Harbor and eventually refloated. They also had super dreadnoughts, the Pennsylvania class of 2 ships and the Colorado class of 3 ships. They were essentially commissioned just after World War I. The Pennsylvania included USS Arizona, which was sunk at Pearl Harbor and is now a designated war memorial. She sank at her moorings in Pearl Harbor, taking a good number of her sailors with her, sadly. The Colorado was undergoing a refit at the time of Pearl Harbor, so she wasn't there. And in fact, all the Colorado class survived the war. The Colorado are interesting in that they're the first battleships to mount 16-inch guns, and Colorado had 8 of them. The Colorado class had 8 of them. They also had some, let me call them treaty battleships. Some had just been commissioned, which were the North Carolinas. There were 2 of those. They were commissioned in April 41 and carried 9 16-inch guns, could make 28 knots. So they were the US Navy's first proper fast battleships. They displaced 35,000 tons, which, as we will remember from last week, was the limit placed under the Washington Treaty in terms of overall displacement. They were similar in many respects to the Nelson class, the Royal Navy battleships. They were not present at Pearl Harbor, having just been commissioned. The North Carolina is preserved as a museum ship to this day in Wilmington, North Carolina. On the right there, you've got the South Dakota class, which were commissioned after Pearl from May 1942 through to about late 1942. They include the USS Massachusetts, which that picture is of. They were also carried 9 16-inch guns and could do 27 knots. So they were decent fast battleships. They displaced 38,000 tons fully loaded. The Massachusetts, aside from operating in the Pacific, she supported the torch landings in North Africa, where she engaged with the Vichy French battleship Jean Bart and disabled her. Massachusetts is also now a museum ship in Battleship Cove at New Bedford, Massachusetts. I was actually on board her, and I think it was 2015. So, at the time of Pearl, the Americans had 10 battleships. They then commissioned, in my opinion, the ultimate battleships, the Iowa class. Here they are. There's USS Iowa on her left firing a broadside. Notice how the broadside shifts the whole ship. And you see the wake or the ship isn't actually underway. She just fires a broadside and she moves several meters away from the direction of the broadside. And the USS Missouri on the right, they had 9 16-inch 50 caliber. Now remember, 50 caliber means the length of the barrel is 50 times 16 inches, which in our money is roughly 20 meters, a little over 20 meters. Those barrels are 20 meters long, the length of a cricket pitch. She carried an arsenal of anti-aircraft guns, mainly because she was designed to escort aircraft carriers, and she had to be able to do 33 knots, therefore to keep up with an aircraft carrier launching aircraft. They displaced 49,000 tons in standard trim and 58,000 tons fully loaded. The interesting point about that is, of course, going up between the South Dakotas to the Iowas was 10,000 tons difference. That was what was needed to get the extra 6 knots. It's to do with the physics of the square of the force needed to push it along an extra 6 knots. So that cost them an extra 10,000 tons of battleship, which, if you consider the alternative, the opportunity cost of something like 5 destroyers, they're about 2,000 tons each destroyers. The Iowas had a complement of just under 2,000 officers and men. So let's have a look at the Imperial Japanese Navy. Also a lot of old battleships. They had 4 World War I dreadnoughts, the Fuso and the Ise. They had converted the Ise into what they called carrier battleships. If you look at the Ise on the right there, you will see a little seaplane on the aft deck. They could carry a whole squadron of seaplanes that they could launch and hangar and look after on board the ship. These were World War I dreadnoughts, both of them. They carried 12 14-inch guns and made 22 odd knots. Both of the Fuso, this is the guys on the left, were sunk in Surigao Strait in October 1944, about which more later. The Ise and the Hyuga were, I think, also went down at some various points during World War II. I don't think they survived the war. The super dreadnoughts, they had a couple of super dreadnoughts and the odd treaty battleship. The Nagato and the Mitsu there on the left. The Mitsu went down after an accidental magazine explosion in Tokyo. The Nagato on the left here survived the war, only to suffer the same fate as the German cruiser Prince Eugen, and had an atom bomb dropped on her in Bikini Atoll. Very sad fate. One thing to look at about these battleships is these masts. You see them here. The Japanese called them a pagoda mast. The Royal Navy called them Christmas trees. They're very ugly, great big masts. And the reasons for them, they carried a lot of range-finding equipment there, and they carried big searchlights so that they could light up their targets. The battleships on the right are interesting in that they were originally battle cruisers to the class of the design of the Lion class battle cruisers built for the Royal Navy. The Congo herself was built during World War I by Vickers in Cumbria. Barrington in Cumbria was built by Vickers. They then had an agreed technology transfer, and the Japanese built the remaining 4 of the Congo class in Japan. They carried 8 14-inch guns and could do over 30 knots by the time they were rebuilt during the 30s to turn them into proper battleships rather than battle cruisers, give them more armor. Their engines were improved, and they could do over 30 knots by the time that World War II came around. At IJN Congo, there you see on the right, was actually built in the UK. None of the Congos survived the war. Now, I must talk a little bit about these 2 monsters. The Japanese built what I would call ultra battleships, the Yamato class, the Yamato and the Musashi. They displaced nearly 72,000 tons. They were 256 meters long, and they carried 9 18-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. They could make 27 knots. and they had a crew complement of over 3,200 officers and men. Japan started constructing these after she withdrew from both the League of Nations and the Washington Naval Treaty in 1934. They were apparently designed to engage multiple enemy battleships at the same time. They were laid down in 1938 and completed in conditions of great secrecy. They were completed after Pearl Harbor, and they were the largest ships ever to have been built in Japan. The launching of Musashi also presented problems. She was launched in the city of Nagasaki, and they subjected the city to an air raid drill on launch day so that nobody could see her being launched. The launch caused a 1.2-meter tsunami that rumbled around the harbor and up the river, flooding homes and capsizing small fishing boats. They had a rather sad career in many respects, Yamato Musashi. They spent most of the war as troop and equipment transports. They were based in Truk Harbor. You can see that's Truk Harbor on the left in the Caroline Islands. Musashi had been torpedoed in early 1944 and had to go back to Japan for repairs. She was sunk eventually a few months later by carrier-based torpedo and dive bombers during the Battle for Leyte Gulf in October 1944, about which more later. She is reported to have taken hits from 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. She never fired her main armament against another ship. Yamato was also based in Truk, survived the Leyte Gulf action, where she helped sink an American small fleet carrier, escort carrier. She was sunk by US aircraft eventually during Operation Tengo, which was the defense of Okinawa in April 1945. The plan was that she was to go to Okinawa, beach herself, be used as an anti-aircraft platform until such time as she was put out of action. Sadly, she never got as far as Okinawa. She was also hit by a good number of torpedoes, I think at least 11, and 6 bombs. Her magazines exploded and she rolled over and took nearly all her 3,000 crew with her. A sad end to some mighty ships. This is a model of Yamato, 1/10 scale model at Kure Naval Museum in the prefecture of Hiroshima. It's interesting that those two ships were built in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who later suffered the fate we know they did. Now, let's have a look at what happened at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked the island of Oahu broadly, and Pearl Harbor in particular. You can see Pearl Harbor, if you look carefully down the bottom here, a very fine natural harbor with a little narrow entrance. It was the base of the US Pacific Fleet. They particularly target battleships at their moorings on Ford Island in the middle of Pearl, known as Battleship Row. They sink 4 battleships and damage another 4 so badly that they're out of action for months. The attack is launched by 360 aircraft from 6 aircraft carriers at a position some 300 kilometers northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. The aircraft were in fact detected by US Army radar, but misidentified as a squadron of bombers due in from California. Let's see what happened.
The targets of the torpedo bombers and Kate bombers were 7 battleships that were moored in the Battleship Row near Ford Island. 51 dive bombers were ordered to bomb air bases Hickam and Wheeler and Ford Island. That airborne attack was to be supported by 43 Zero fighters. Apart from the aforementioned air bases, the fighters also had to attack airfields Ewa and Kaneohe.
At 7:55, the crews of the ships were preparing to raise the colors. On Nevada, they will be accompanied by the ship's band, 23 personnel, including the conductor. At 7:58, the conductor noticed aircraft coming in over the harbor, and shortly thereafter, the line of ships was rocked by underwater explosions. Nevertheless, at 8 a.m. sharp, the band began to play the national anthem.
The memories of those sailors who survived the attack describe that first terrifying assault the best.
Aviation metalsmith second class Adolf Kuhn on Ford Island. A Japanese pilot swooped down low in front of me where I could see his bomb bay doors open. He released a huge bomb heading straight for my tractor.
I said to myself, Adolf, this is it for sure. With my foot on my brake and hands on top of my head like I did in a little crowded boat earlier, I prayed again. After all, I'd missed mass this morning. I saw the bomb into the concrete runway, ripping out huge chunks of cement lace and reinforcing steel, which landed on nearby rooftops and equipment, while smaller pieces hit my tractor and bounced off, some hitting my arm and shoulder. Again, I thanked my guardian angel.
Signalman second class Richard E. Burge, USS Tennessee. I watched the fleet destroyed right before my eyes.
I watched the fleet destroyed right before my eyes. The USS Arizona was anchored 50 feet to the stern of our ship. She took several bombs and torpedoes, raised up, and quickly sank to the bottom of the harbor. USS West Virginia and USS Oklahoma took several torpedoes. The West Virginia sank alongside us. The USS Oklahoma, which was anchored forward of the West Virginia, capsized completely.
The USS Maryland, anchored forward of us, took a bomb and its bow sank.
People often want to know what damage was received in the first few minutes of the air raid, and the answer to that is it was quite a lot. In fact, the surprise is one of the fundamentals of war, and the Japanese used that with overwhelming success. You have to remember this: the aircraft carrier had never been used before the way that enemy aviation was being used against the United States on December 7th, 1941. So they didn't really feel like it was a practical possibility for there to be an airborne attack against Oahu.
It was raid planner and first wave commander Mitsuo Fuchida who had sent the signal Tora, Tora, Tora to the carrier Akagi. This signal meant two things. First, complete surprise had been attained, and second, World War II had just expanded to the Pacific.
At around 10 a.m., the Japanese attack concluded. Their aircraft turned back and flew off to the north. The airplane of Captain Fuchida stayed over Oahu Island for some time, so the pilot could take photos of the US base after the attack. A devastating strike was inflicted on the US Pacific Fleet on December 7, 1941. Out of 8 battleships, none remained in service. Arizona, West Virginia, California, and Oklahoma had been sunk. Nevada had run aground. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee were heavily damaged. Light cruisers Helena, Honolulu, and Raleigh had also received damage and were forced out of action for a long time. Destroyers Downs and Cassin were destroyed. Shaw was heavily damaged. 174 Army and Naval aircraft were completely destroyed. 121 more aircraft received severe damage. Some of them would later be decommissioned. 3,581 people were killed or wounded as a result of the attack. The Japanese squadron lost 29 out of the 350 aircraft of the task force. 55 pilots were considered dead.
Quite often we hear about certain things that could have really led to a more total victory for the Japanese. And several of those are the fact that they did not hit the fuel tanks that are stored here, the fact that the aircraft carriers that were originally the primary target happened to be away at sea, fortunately, as we know now. a short 7 months later, they inflicted overwhelming damage on the Japanese fleet at Midway, sinking 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that originally attacked Pearl Harbor. And the third of those being that they did not bomb the actual shipyard where they could service and repair damaged ships.
A couple of hours after the attack, US experts were already looking for the way to raise the sunken ships from the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Almost all of the battleships, except for Arizona and Oklahoma, were eventually repaired. The former of 2 was back in service as early as in February of 1942.
3 days later, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse come up against Japanese bombers and torpedo bombers. The Japanese invasion of Malaya commenced the very next day, on the 8th of December. And on the 10th, Force Z, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the cruiser Repulse and 4 destroyers were sailing 110 kilometers off the coast of what is now Malaya. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips' plan was to interdict the Japanese invasion convoys in the South China Sea, but he'd lost the element of surprise and he'd actually turned for home at this point. It's also important to note that Prince of Wales mounted one of the most advanced anti-aircraft systems of the time. During a Malta convoy a few months earlier, Prince of Wales had shot down a good number of Italian aircraft. Extreme heat and humidity, however, had rendered her radar fire control systems unserviceable, and it had also deteriorated her 2-pounder ammunition. Had he in fact attacked the convoys a day earlier, he might well have been successful, because the Japanese aircraft had not yet arrived. They had only just got there. The Japanese bombers found them at around 11 o'clock on 10th of December. 1 bomb hits Repulse without scoring significant damage. Then the torpedo bombers attack. And I will let Drakenifel take up the story.
Even so, the attack was less successful in terms of hits scored than the obsolete Swordfish attack on the Bismarck. The Repulse evaded 7 torpedoes and all the bombs in what was quite frankly a magnificent display of seamanship. The Prince of Wales evaded 7 torpedoes and almost dodged the 8th, but when this struck, that was curtains. The torpedo hit the port side just aft of the rear turret, rupturing bulkheads along the outer propeller shaft and causing significant flooding. However, the propeller shaft was also bent, and with its mounting destroyed, it began to rotate around like a gigantic flail, ripping apart the hull of the ship for a considerable distance before it could be stopped. This understandably caused flooding extensive enough to also short out the electrical system to the rear of the ship, which left the pumps offline. With a huge gash in the side of the ship and no pumps available, Prince of Wales began to list heavily in a very short period of time. Another torpedo attack was launched on the Repulse, which again managed to dodge all incoming torpedoes. However, with Prince of Wales unable to contribute much anti-aircraft fire, with the electrical system down and the 5.25-inch guns and pom-poms either pointing at the water or too high in the sky, the next attack by 17 Type 1 bombers in a pincer manoeuvre finally managed to score hits on the Repulse. Having avoided 19 torpedoes, the ship now took 4 hits, slowed and began to capsize, as unlike her sister Renown, the Repulse had not been refitted with torpedo blisters and internal bulkheads, which were needed on a modern capital ship. Another 6 bombers attacked the crippled Prince of Wales and scored another 3 hits, which would cause further flooding, although the torpedo defence system successfully blocked damage in the areas which it covered that were hit. The ship continued to list to port despite these 3 hits being on the starboard side, which showed where the vast majority of the damage had been done. This was followed by a 1,110-pound bomb hit, which the main deck armour protected the ship's vitals against, but could not stop mass casualties in an aid centre set up above the armour deck. A number of near misses caused further minor leaks, and just after 1 in the afternoon the order to abandon ship was given. The ship sank at 1:20 in the afternoon, taking 327 men, including the captain and admiral, with her. The destroyers Electra and Vampire moved in to rescue survivors of the Repulse, whilst Express rescued those from Prince of Wales. A total of 840 sailors would be lost, 513 in Repulse and 327 in Prince of Wales. The next day, Japanese Lieutenant Haruki Iki flew to the site of the battle and dropped 2 wreaths of flowers into the sea to honour combatants from both sides who had died in the battle. One would be for fellow members of his Kanoya Air Group, whilst the other was for British sailors whose display of bravery in defence of the ships had gained them the utmost admiration from all the pilots in his squadron. The sinking of the 2 ships would severely weaken the British Eastern Fleet in Singapore, and the Japanese invasion fleet would only be engaged by submarines until the Battle of Endao on the 27th of January 1942. Had these ships survived, it's possible they could have helped turn the tide in the Battle of Singapore by attacking and possibly sinking the invasion fleet.
The bulk of the rest of the war in the Pacific really is fought between submarines, American submarines attacking Japanese supply convoys and supply ships, and involving aircraft carriers between the Japanese Navy and the American Navy. Battle of Midway was really decisive because it took out most, as the guy in the movie said, took out most of the big Japanese carriers. We get then to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is the end of October 1944. The Americans were about to land on the island of Leyte, which is here on the bottom right down here, where the numbers 4 and 2 are. The Japanese plan was to interdict them, and they mobilized pretty much everything they had. And there were 4 largely separate engagements in this battle. The only battleships which we're talking about, aircraft carriers are a story for another day. The battleships are in Central Force under Admiral Kurihita and Southern Force under Admiral Nishimura. By far the biggest fleet is this Central Force. The Admiral Kurita had 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, and 10 heavy cruisers. A couple of US submarines had done them damage before they even got there. The USS Dace and Data had sunk 2 heavy cruisers and severely damaged a 3rd. In the Subayan Sea, which is this bit in the middle where number 1 is indicated, the fleet came under attack from USS carriers Enterprise and Franklin. Musashi was severely damaged in that. She slowed, and eventually she was sunk by another wave of attacks from Enterprise and Franklin. These were these carriers that were up here on the top right-hand side. The Musashi never made it out of the Subayan Sea. The rest of the fleet does actually get out of the Subayan Sea, and they engage with some American escort carriers and some destroyers. You've still got 4 battleships, including Yamato. You've got a whole lot of heavy cruisers, and up against them, you've got little escort carriers mounting a single 5-inch gun. At some point, the captain of one of them gives an order, okay, guys, open fire with pop guns. They, however, manage to convince the Admiral Kurita that they're up against a much bigger foe, because he was aware that this 3rd fleet was in the area, the guys who were away to the north here. And he decides enough's enough, and he pushes off back away from Leyte, enabling the landings to proceed. That night, the Southern Force under Admiral Nishimura, which heads for the Surigao Strait. This is the Surigao Strait down here to the south of Leyte, with those 2 battleships we saw before, the Yamashiro and the Fuso, a heavy cruiser and 4 destroyers. It was, however, a deadly trap, because the Americans knew they were coming, and they had lined up 5 battleships at the mouth of the strait there, and they had a whole lot of torpedo boats and destroyers. Let's see what happens next.
As the Southern Force began its approach on the Surigao Strait, Nishimura ordered his 4 destroyers in front of the pack to protect his battleships. At 10:50 p.m., 39 PT boats from the U.S. 7th Fleet made visual contact with the Japanese forces. Several sections of PT boats attempted to torpedo the Japanese ships, but were driven off by a hail of gunfire. The attacks lasted until 2:13 in the morning and provided yet more crucial information on the location of the Japanese fleet. By this time, the Americans were in formation and waiting for the Southern Force as it made its approach. The first American ships to attack Nishimura's forces were that of Destroyer Squadron 54, commanded by Captain Jesse Coward. Shortly after 3 a.m., Destroyers Remy, McGowan, and Melvin began launching their torpedoes, and within 2 minutes they had launched 27 in all. They were met by a gauntlet of 5-inch shells, but quickly retreated out of gunfire range from the Japanese ships. Of the 27 torpedoes launched, 2 or 3 of them detonated on the starboard side of the Japanese battleship Fuso, knocking it out of the battle and later causing it to sink in several pieces. At this time, the second group of destroyers from Desron 54 began firing their torpedoes. Now aware of the attacking American destroyers, Nishimura ordered 2 90-degree evasive turns to avoid the torpedoes. This was ineffective, as the destroyer Monson obtained 1 hit on the flagship Yamashiro, while destroyer McDermott hit 3 of the Japanese destroyers, sinking Yamagumo and Mishishio, and blowing off the bow of Asagumo and forcing her to retire. Desron 54's attack was devastating to the Japanese fleet, and would later be hailed as one of the most successful naval attacks of the war by a single unit. Close behind, Desron 24, comprised of both American and Australian destroyers, fired their torpedoes at the battleship Yamashiro and the destroyer Shiguire. 1 torpedo from the destroyer Colleen hit Yamashiro, slowing it to 5 knots, but not yet crippling her. A stray torpedo from the destroyer Hutchins managed to hit the already damaged Mishishio, immediately sinking it. Just before 4 in the morning, as Desron 24 began to withdraw, Desron 56 from the left flank began the final torpedo attack of the battle. As the first section of Desron 56 fired for no effect on the Japanese ships, the second section, commanded by Captain Smoot, pressed the attack to a shorter range than any of the other previous destroyer engagements of the battle. Launching from a range of 6,200 yards, the destroyer Newcomb hit the battleship Yamashiro once again. This close-range assault brought Captain Smoot's section under intense fire from both Japanese and American ships. The destroyer Albert W. Grant was hit by 18 shells, 11 of which came from an American light cruiser, and was brought to a stop. It would later be hauled to safety by the Newcomb. The American battleships and cruisers had only begun firing a few minutes prior to the incident. They had been tensely waiting for the Japanese ships to come within range. At 3:51 in the morning on October 25, 1944, the last true battleship-to-battleship engagement would begin, with Admiral Oldendorf's order to open fire. Nishimura steamed boldly into the barrage, supported by only the heavy cruiser Mogami and the destroyer Shiguire. He was still unaware that his battleship Fuso was lying dead in the water. The remaining Japanese ships fired desperately at the American battle line, for little effect. Admiral Oldendorf called for a ceasefire at 4 in the morning to give the Grant and Newcomb time to retire. At this time, the battleship Yamashiro would turn south to retreat, only to capsize at 4:19, taking down Admiral Nishimura and all but a few members of the crew. The heavy cruiser Mogami and the destroyer Shiguire retreated southward and escaped. They came into contact with Admiral Shima's 2nd Striking Force soon after, who had been trailing the southern force at a range of about 40 miles. The 2nd Striking Force would engage the visible American ships with torpedoes, but after surveying the carnage from the battle that took place only a few minutes prior, Admiral Shima decided to withdraw, thus ending the Battle of Surigao Strait and bringing the age of battleships to a close.
He says that's the end of the age of battleships, and in many respects it was. However, I'm going to show you a little movie now because it features my favorite battleship. I built a plastic model of when I was still in primary school. It sat on the mantelpiece of our holiday house for some years. So here we go. This is after the war.
World War II in the Pacific, 4 years of bloody hell, came to an end here. September 2nd, 1945, a solemn ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. A mighty warship and a peace to celebrate. The ship was packed with hundreds of sailors, Marines, reporters, cameramen, and top military brass with legendary names: Nimitz, Halsey, Wainwright, McCain, representatives of 9 Allied nations, and Supreme Allied Commander General Douglas MacArthur. Just before 9 that morning, the Japanese representatives approached the Missouri. They boarded in silence, took their places, and the brief ceremony began.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
MacArthur was about to become the interim ruler of Japan, and the Japanese people, defeated and afraid, did not know what to expect until this moment.
I announce it my firm purpose to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance.
Justice and tolerance. With those words, one Japanese delegate later said, "The deck of the Missouri was transformed into an altar of peace." The Japanese foreign minister signed the instrument of surrender, followed by the Army Chief of Staff. General MacArthur signed. Eyewitnesses saw his hands tremble. The Allied nations signed as well, bearing witness to the end of the worst war in human history. World War II finally was over.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
At that moment, as if on cue, the sun came out, and as the Japanese departed, a stunning aerial display. More than 2,000 Allied aircraft flew in formation over the Missouri. In Washington, President Harry Truman marked the moment.
The thoughts and hopes of all America, indeed of all the civilized world, are centered tonight on the battleship Missouri.
It was no accident that the surrender took place aboard the Missouri. The ship was named for Truman's home state. The previous year, then Senator Truman watched his daughter christen the Missouri as it was launched into New York Harbor. Just weeks after the surrender, the ship was back in New York, welcomed by thousands, including President Truman. He visited the spot where the war had ended. He sat at the surrender table to sign the guest book and described it as the happiest day of his life. Today, with this plaque marking its now famous deck, the Missouri is anchored where World War II began for the United States. Mighty Mo now stands proudly and at peace at Pearl Harbor.
I just want to have a quick word about the Royal Navy's last battleship. There she is, HMS Vanguard. She was the only other battleship built for the Royal Navy after the war. She was effectively the last battleship ever to be commissioned new anywhere in the world. The US Navy laid up and recommissioned the Iowa class at various times, which we'll see in a minute. She was launched by Princess Elizabeth, as she was, in November 1944, but not commissioned before war's end. She displaced 44,000 tons, a little smaller than the Iowas, and carried 8 15-inch guns. She had 4 Old Faithful Parsons steam turbines that gave her a top speed of just under 32 knots. Her first duty was to bring the British royal family on their first ever tour to South Africa. She'd been scheduled to take them on a tour to Australasia the following year, but the King's health prevented that. The tour was cancelled. He had, in fact, scheduled a short tour aboard Vanguard in the Mediterranean in 1952, but sadly died before he could enjoy it. Just before decommissioning in 1960, scenes from the film Sink the Bismarck that we saw in the last week were shot aboard Vanguard. Another interesting thing about Vanguard is that sections of her 150mm steel body armor remain in use as pre-atomic steel plate, in other words, made before the first atom bomb, pre-atomic steel plate of the whole body monitor at Britain's Radiobiological Research Lab. So bits of her are still in use. She was also the ship that our late colleague Robin Richards, Deirdre's husband, served aboard during his national service in the late 50s. The Royal Navy can't afford this sort of thing. All 4 Iowa-class battleships were placed on reserve at the end of the war. They were subsequently recommissioned at various points thereafter. 3 of them were used to bombard enemy positions during the Korean War. They were fitted with cruise missile launchers and used during Desert Storm, another Middle East conflict. Eventually, all 4 were decommissioned in the early 90s, but all 4 were preserved as museum ships. We saw the Missouri in Pearl Harbor a few minutes ago. This is Iowa. She's in Los Angeles Harbor. The New Jersey is in Camden, New Jersey. Where else? And the Wisconsin is in Norfolk, Virginia. There we are. The Americans can afford to keep their battleships. Sadly, the Royal Navy can't. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Do you have any questions? The question was, why did Force Z not have proper air cover when there was indeed air cover available in Singapore? They were offered air support, and I think they said they didn't need it. They were supposed to have an aircraft carrier with them as well, which had run aground somewhere like Ceylon or something and was nowhere to be seen. If they had an aircraft carrier, that would also have made a big difference, as was seen in the Mediterranean, which is also a story for another day. Mediterranean convoys, if you had an aircraft carrier, it made a big difference. The question was it the fault of the Royal Navy that Force Z was sunk in the Gulf of Siam, where they could have had some air support? They could, in theory, have had some air support out of Singapore. I think they decided it wasn't really worthwhile because they wouldn't have been able to spend very long over the ships. They're 100 and some kilometers away. It would take them a while to get there. They wouldn't have the fuel to stay long. That's why having an aircraft carrier with you is important, because you can land and take them off and you're there all the time. The lack of an aircraft carrier was undoubtedly significant to that incident. But Churchill, I think, said was that his worst day of the war was the loss of Force Z. And later he said that was his absolute worst day of the whole war, was the loss of those two ships.
Thanks. Rod, you mentioned the one Japanese ship had been built in the UK. Am I correct in thinking that the whole Japanese Navy, when they established the Navy, they brought the UK, the Royal Navy in to train them and to get them on a footing? And so basically the Japanese Navy is based on the Royal Navy.
You have to go back a bit before the Congos. The Japanese pre-dreadnoughts, which defeated the Russian pre-dreadnoughts in Port Arthur and just off the Korean Peninsula in 1904. This was a pre-dreadnought battle, and the Japanese pre-dreadnoughts were all built in the UK. Then they built the Congo in Vickers Yard, and the Vickers guys came and helped them build the next four. Bear in mind, the Japanese and the British were close allies up until about 1930. It may well have gone much further than simply providing their ships. It may have gone as far as actually training and all sorts of things. Collins says that he thinks the system of the entire structure of the Imperial Japanese Navy was a photocopy, really, of the Royal Navy. Yeah, it may well have been. It may well have been. They certainly were close allies and operated together, certainly during World War I, say all the way up until the mid-30s, when the Japanese imperial expansion bumped up against British colonial interests in the form of Hong Kong and Singapore, obviously, in Malaya. Thank you.